Good morning to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook video for today, Saturday, June 29th, 2024. There's a lot, and I mean a lot to go over today. We have Tropical Storm Beryl, which is very quickly intensifying, and it might become Major Hurricane Beryl now. That is officially now out of the National Hurricane Center as it approaches the Windward Islands on Monday. But it does not look like the threat to land ends there because we're also watching other areas in the Atlantic too. One of them, obviously, Invest 94L, which I've definitely not forgotten about, and that looks like it could develop or could have a chance to develop in the Bay of Campeche between tonight and tomorrow. And there's also another area, once again, in the MDR, surprisingly enough, in late June, that we're watching that also could potentially threaten the islands right after Beryl, and within the next coming days, into next week. So there's a lot to go over today. Let's get started right away, with a satellite true color image of the Atlantic. And this is really neat because you could see everything that is going on right now. There's Invest 94L moved in over the Yucatan Peninsula. You could actually see, though, that there is quite a bit of spin associated with 94L. Not quite a closed low-level center. This is somewhat still a broad system, but you notice that there is definitely convective activity with this storm, even as it's moving over the Yucatan Peninsula. So that might beg the question, since it's over the Yucatan now, how will it do once it gets over the Bay of Campeche later tonight and into tomorrow, where it'll only have a short time for it to really be able to try and develop. But given how things are going so far in the Atlantic, wouldn't shock me if this really quickly tries and barely becomes a tropical depression or even tropical storm, another tropical storm, before the month is over and before it moves inland tomorrow night and early Monday morning, but potentially as well, before the month is over, because tomorrow is the last day of the month. And if we're able to get another named storm out of this month, even if just barely, from 94L, that would certainly make things quite interesting. And then there's the main talk of the show, the main talk of the town, I should say, actually. There's Beryl spinning away in the Atlantic. It is very much on its way to becoming a hurricane at this point. The National Hurricane Center has it at 65 miles an hour as of the 11 a.m. advisory. We'll go over the advisory in just a moment, but it's strengthening. Definitely has that shrimpy look, that look with the banding. We kind of call it the shrimp look. Basically, it means that it has the look of an intensifying storm, and then we have more energy coming off of Africa, which we'll probably need to watch, unfortunately, into next week. And it could, because of potential impacts that might not end, after Beryl moves through the islands. Really quickly, let's take a look at the 850 millibar vorticity. And this is a really neat product because you could also see not only where systems are located, but how much energy they have in terms of the spin in the atmosphere. That's the 850 millibar vorticity. 850 millibars meaning roughly 5,000 feet up or so from the surface. So this is a really neat product to see how much vorticity there is. And you can see, as I said, with 94L, decent amount of vorticity, although it is somewhat broad. I think there's some sort of monsoon trough sort of thing associated with 94L. So it's really going to depend on how much it organizes quickly over the next day or so that it'll have in the Bay of Campeche before it moves into Mexico Sunday night into early Monday. So there's that. And then we also have out here Tropical Storm Beryl. And this is really neat because this really puts into perspective the organization that Beryl has in the atmosphere in terms of its vorticity. Look at how round and compact that is, and also how tight and how high end, on the scale, some of these vorticity values, you could see that Beryl is starting to acquire. It's a little covered up. Kind of don't like how they placed the icon for the tropical storm, but whatever. You generally get the point that vorticity is very compact. This storm has a very well-defined center, and that is definitely going to aid it in terms of its development, potentially into a hurricane, and as I'll show you in a moment by the National Hurricane Center, even potentially a major hurricane as well. So this is the latest stuff, the latest products out of the homepage of the National Hurricane Center. We have obviously Invest 94L that has a 40% chance, a moderate chance over the next day or two that it could potentially form. And the National Hurricane Center actually mentions that a tropical depression in the Bay of Campeche is possible over the weekend. And then obviously we have Tropical Storm Beryl, 65 miles per hour with a minimum central pressure of 998 millibars. If you're tracking it is now exactly at 10 north in latitude, and longitude is 47.8 west. And it is moving pretty brisk right now at 23 miles per hour to the west. And then we have what will probably soon to be Invest 96L. It's not Invest 96L yet, but I'm saying very likely soon to be Invest 96L to the east of Beryl, with a 60% chance, or up to a 60% chance, that it could potentially develop into a tropical system as it moves west-northwest, once again on a trajectory towards the islands. So the interest in the islands need to watch out for Beryl, but then they also need to keep their eye out on this area of interest right here, which probably once again will be future 96L, because it looks like they might not be done watching the tropics after Beryl moves through. We'll go over 96, or keep on saying 96L, but we'll go over all of this with the modeling later on. But since we're now bringing up Beryl, just want to really quickly show you it is 65 miles an hour. All the information on the National Hurricane Center homepage, and I think the big key point that you need to take away from what we're about to go over says it right pretty well in the headline by the National Hurricane Center. Beryl expected to become a dangerous major hurricane before reaching the Windward Islands, and they now have more hurricane watches issued. This morning when I did a tropical weather update specifically on Beryl, the island of Barbados was only under a hurricane watch. Since then, they've added much more hurricane watches for the rest of the Windward Islands, and some tropical storm watches too for other areas. Once again, all of that we'll go over in just a moment. But really quickly, just to get out of the way, this is 94L over the Yucatan. You can see convection is firing. Definitely some sort of spin associated with it. I will mention, though, regardless of whether or not it develops, it'll probably bring heavy rains and flash flooding once again to Central America. I mean, this is coming on the heels of last week when we had, obviously, Alberto and another area of interest in this general region. They've really been getting a lot of tropical weather or stuff of tropical interest recently, and it definitely looks like it's not going to end. Although, I will mention, once again, at least as of the 12Z, 94L is obviously going to move into the Bay of Campeche. Roughly seems like it only has about the next 48 hours or so to really develop, or try to develop at least, before it then eventually moves inland over Mexico. And once again, this will probably happen Sunday night into Monday morning. And because of that, none of the model guidance is not really enthusiastic on 94L, but obviously you could see they do actually, show some enthusiasm. Actually, I'll take that back. At least in showing it potentially becoming a tropical storm. Some of the intensity guidance does have that occurring, so it's still possible. We'll just have to wait and see. But it wouldn't shock me if 94L does try to do something in the Bay of Campeche tomorrow, so we'll have to monitor that really closely. But now, on to the storm that I think everybody is waiting to hear about, is Beryl. Really shocking how much it's been able to organize between yesterday, when it just got designated as a tropical depression yesterday afternoon, and now it's already 65 miles an hour. I remember if you remember watching our video from last night on Beryl, or it was then Tropical Depression 2, it was only 35 miles an hour. Now we're seeing 65 miles an hour associated with Beryl right now. And you could clearly see why it's been intensifying quite a bit. Lots of continuous deep convective bursts over the center. There was also a microwave pass earlier this morning. I mentioned this in the morning update, but microwave pass, basically some of the satellite tools that we use to determine a storm's developing tropical cyclone, and a well-developed tropical cyclone too, but one of the satellite tools that we use, and we call it the microwave imagery, was able to pick out that Beryl was developing a inner core, and you could definitely see that she's still trying to do that, especially with all these convective bursts blowing up on the center, and this is only going to help Beryl intensify further. And it wouldn't even shock me because the National Hurricane Center expected this to become a hurricane tonight into tomorrow morning. It wouldn't even shock me if it happens later today, even this afternoon or this evening, if it continues on this pace. One probable thing, though, that Beryl will have to fight against is potentially dry air. That's why it looks slightly a little more ragged right now. Not trying to downcast this or trying to use it as a way to say that Beryl won't be as strong. It's just the facts of what's happening right now. There's a lot of dry air to the north. Obviously, given that it's June and that there's Saharan air, and usually that would be enough to allow storms like Beryl not to happen, but it's already favorable enough that we're getting something like Beryl happening, but it's going to deal with dry air to the north. But if it's able to continue with these convective bursts that you're seeing right now on the satellite, I can assure you that Beryl will absolutely intensify. And we might as well be looking at a major hurricane that the National Hurricane Center is forecasting. Actually, let's take a look at the cone now. This is the 11 a.m. cone by the National Hurricane Center, and it actually seems like they expect this to become a hurricane by tonight, actually. So maybe they're kind of catching on to the fact now it's already 65 miles an hour. It's already intensified quite a bit. And now they're expecting a hurricane, it seems like, sometime later this evening, maybe tonight. And then they expect this to become a major hurricane now. Quite unusual to see, especially that the date is still June 29th. And this is really, as I talked about many times, so over the last several days, this is something really unusual for June. And it just goes to show how favorable the atmosphere is for this hurricane season. So Beryl, as we're seeing it right now, expected to become a major hurricane as it passes through the islands, will enter the Caribbean, the Eastern Caribbean, as a major hurricane. And then in the days 4 and 5 range, once this gets past the Windward Islands, we then got to watch for interests throughout the entire Caribbean, because it looks like past that we could see this potentially still a hurricane, although weakening probably because things will start to get a little bit less favorable in the Central Caribbean, at least in terms of wind shear. So we might see this weaken a little bit, but this will still probably be a hurricane, especially it really depends on how strong it gets as it passes through the Windward Islands. National Hurricane expecting a Category 3. Some intensity guidance, and I will say some, do actually bring this into a Category 4 range. And let's actually talk about that right now. This is the model intensity guidance as of the 12Z run for Beryl. You could definitely see the confidence for hurricane is high. If you remember from this morning's update, the model intensity guidance had a few members that were still kind of down here at only bringing this to low end to moderate tropical storm intensity. They've now all shifted to at least strong tropical storm intensity, and now you could definitely tell almost all of the model guidance is confident in Beryl becoming a hurricane and at least some point in its life. And now increasingly as of the 12Z update, and this is probably why this is what prompted probably the National Hurricane Center to upgrade Beryl to potentially become a major. Notice majority of the model guidance spread is now in this potentially becoming a Category 3. And even we have a few members, surprisingly enough, bringing this potentially into Category 4 strength. But that'll probably happen as it's entering the Eastern Caribbean, probably not, hopefully not, before the islands yet. So that's the intensity guidance, and that kind of puts into perspective what we're really expecting with Beryl as it enters the Caribbean once again. Hurricane watches are in effect for the islands. This is Barbados. I believe it's St. Vincent and the Grenadines as well. And I know there's St. Lucia in here. Let's actually read it out. Let's go to the public advisory and see what kind of warnings we have right now. So a hurricane watch is in effect for Barbados, St. Lucia, I was right, St. Vincent and the Grenadine Islands, and Grenada. So if you're in any 4 of these areas, you should be making your hurricane preparations right now. because that is where a hurricane watch is in effect for. And then we also have a tropical storm watch in effect for Tobago and Martinique. So if you're in any of these islands, that means potential hurricane slash tropical storm force winds are to be felt. And it looks like we might have those impacts very soon, given that watches are in effect. So with that being said, since we have the kind of the general outline of the impacts, this is also another really neat graphic by the National Hurricane Center. The key messages to expect out of Tropical Storm Beryl. One, and probably the most important thing, is that Beryl is expected to rapidly strengthen and be a major hurricane when it reaches the Windward Islands late Sunday night or Monday, bringing destructive hurricane force winds and life-threatening storm surge, which is also another huge impact. Obviously, we're talking about this potentially becoming a major hurricane. It's not like we had with Alberto last week. It definitely feels longer than last week. But yes, Alberto was indeed last week. It's not like we had it with Alberto where it was a broad, weak storm, but because it was very broad and had generally a lot of energy with it, despite the wind speeds being very low, the main concern was heavy rain and storm surge and flash flooding, especially storm surge in Texas, where they got the most of it, surprisingly, given Alberto made landfall in Mexico. Beryl, on the other hand, is going to be a small but powerful hurricane. It's going to be a major hurricane, Category 3 intensity. That is a very powerful storm. And that will mean that the winds will actually be of potential concern. This is in these kind of storms like Beryl, with what it's expected to do, the wind is a hazard. So there will be that. But obviously, as always, and I think the bigger concern as well that people should really not forget is the storm surge. And there's also, and the second key point as well, and as mentioned, and is typical of every tropical system, but heavy rainfall and localized flooding is expected Sunday night and Monday. So starting Sunday night is when we'll see a lot of these impacts in the islands. And as again, interest in the Central and Western Caribbean should monitor the progress of the system. And users are reminded that there is a large uncertainty at days 4 and 5, and not to focus on the specific details of the track or intensity. And that, I think, is such a huge point that everybody needs to mention, especially given that we're going to have an impact with this storm within the next 48 to 60 hours in the Windward Islands. So there's already a lot to focus on with this storm already. And my biggest suggestion is that if you're watching from places like Jamaica or Cuba or Haiti, I would suggest right now to really pay attention to Beryl once it gets into the Eastern Caribbean, because that's when we'll have a lot more certainty. Well, the uncertainty will still be there, but we'll have more certainty on what it's going to do in the Caribbean past the Windward Islands as this moves into the Eastern Caribbean, which is still 2 to 3 days out. And then beyond that, the United States, if you have any United States interests, especially along the Gulf Coast and even the Yucatan and places like that, generally west of the Central Caribbean, west of Jamaica, and it does include the United States as well. Right now, I suggest just watch Beryl, watch what it does in the Caribbean, because any impacts, especially to the United States, I should mention right now, are probably way too early to focus on and get all hyped up or worried about just yet. So I will mention that. So since we're talking about, long range and models and stuff, let's actually bring this over now to what the GFS has. And let me really quickly see if the 12Z started running. Yes, it did, but it's too little to really talk about yet. But actually, you can see from the 12Z to the 6Z, in terms of the time frame of later this afternoon, the GFS does actually uptrend on Beryl, which makes sense given Beryl is expected to be very strong, and expected to probably continue to strengthen over the next several hours. But let's just take a look at the 6Z GFS for now. Strengthens Beryl. Probably already a hurricane by this time Sunday, and then as we get into Monday, Beryl continues to quickly strengthen. 60 hours out, it's already passing through the islands, and it is probably at least Category 2 intensity on the GFS at that point. and then through the next 4 days after that, 96 hours out, the GFS has this at 976 millibars. So that is, and moving towards the Northern Caribbean. So the GFS shows a solution where more of the Northern Caribbean, Greater Antilles Islands need to watch out. But then it comes to the concern, because you could see, and this roughly starts to occur around early next week on Monday, the GFS is starting to form our other area of interest out here. In fact, it actually seems like they try to make this start to develop even into later tomorrow afternoon or evening. So we might need, so as I mentioned earlier, we might see an invest with this area soon. And then as we get into time, really looks like midweek again. So Monday to Wednesday, it's only going to be a 2 or 3 day break that the islands are going to have, unfortunately. That, or at least that's what the GFS shows, before we get Beryl out of here, and we need to start worrying about the area of interest behind Beryl. So that is the GFS's solution. Let's see what the European shows. I'm not really quite sure about the European, because it shows, as of right now, actually as of, let's do 12Z, on Saturday, the European had this initialized at 1,004 millibars, and obviously we know right now, let me actually bring this to 15Z, they initialized it at 15Z as 1,003 millibars, and obviously we know the real intensity of the storm is 998 millibars. So the European is definitely on the weaker side of the forecast, but even the European at this point, they bring this into the low 990s. This is probably a strong tropical storm to even minimal hurricane now on the European, on the 6E run. So we have another model there. We have the GFS, we have the Euro, we also have the hurricane models as well. It looks like the intensity of the confidence is definitely increasing that this will absolutely be at least a hurricane by the islands, if not a major hurricane. And I say that because there's obviously still room for failure to occur with Beryl in terms of its intensity. As I did mention, obviously there's dry air, there's other stuff too. There's still factors that Beryl is competing against when it comes to the climatology in June. And I guess the European, as I mentioned before, but I'll say it again, I think the European is more or less a fail mode, or it represents the fail mode for Beryl. It represents the weaker end of what Beryl might do, as opposed to the GFS and definitely the hurricane models representing a stronger sort of perspective to Beryl. So that moves out, that moves into the Caribbean, and then the European tries to, but doesn't do as much, develop the wave behind Beryl as well, although it doesn't really keep it that, although it really doesn't do too much with it. Let's see, on the 850 millibar of vorticity, it does try a little bit. The European is not as keen about it potentially developing as the GFS does, but we'll have to monitor and see over the next several days, does it actually develop. So we now have the GFS and the European out of the way. Let's see what the global models show. Let me really quickly show this into time. This is the 6E H-Wharf, and this is stopping it at hour 60. This is roughly Monday afternoon. It is approaching the islands at 960 millibars, and the max wind is 111 knots, so that's roughly a high-end Category 3 storm that the H-Wharf has, and it makes landfall in the Windward Islands, and then it moves into the Eastern Caribbean, and the H-Wharf strengthens this into a mid-range Category 4 storm. So there's one model that shows this on approach to the islands as a major hurricane. That's the H-Wharf. The H-Mon, let's see what the H-Mon does. H-Mon also, I think, strengthens this really quickly. In fact, they're even stronger than the H-Wharf. They make this at 108. Actually, they're stronger in pressure, but the winds is still only at Category 3 intensity, although they actually strengthen this really, really closely to Category 4, and then they briefly make this a Category 4 as well. And hold on, that is 950 millibars. That's probably wrong, but I was about to say, it's like H-Mon tries to make a run at Category 5 with Beryl, although I very much doubt that. So I really wouldn't worry about that yet with Beryl. But bottom line, with And by the way, when I say Category 5, I really wouldn't worry about that on approach to the islands. But the H-Wharf is another model, the H-Mon, not the H-Wharf, is another model that shows um, Beryl potentially strengthening into a major hurricane on approach to the islands. Also, at Monday afternoon, it is moving over, I think that is St. Vincent, as a major hurricane as well. So that's two models down. What about the HAFS A? So this is one of the two HAFS models. Let's see what they do. The HAFS is still on the weaker side. I remember in the earlier runs, the HAFS A right now is like the European, is on the weaker side of this sort of the general model consensus. They only show this becoming a mid-range Category 1 as this enters the Caribbean. Once again, I probably would point to the HAFS A being a low-end fail mode for Beryl. And even then, if we're talking about the fail mode, it's still being a minimal hurricane. That definitely shows the fact that the islands should prepare for a hurricane with Beryl no matter what. And then it obviously strengthens that into the Caribbean as further it seems like it brings this very closely to major hurricane intensity even then. So the HAFS A, not quite exactly on approach to the islands, but eventually as it continues to strengthen in the Eastern Caribbean, the HAFS A becomes a major hurricane with Beryl. And then we have the HAFS B. Let's see what that shows. Basically shows the same thing as the H-Wharf and the H-Mon. They strengthen this into a high-end Category 3 on approach to the islands Monday afternoon. So that's 3 of the 4 hurricane models which strengthen this into a major hurricane as it approaches the Caribbean islands. The GFS strengthens this into a Category 2. So you could generally see where the consensus is for the potential that Beryl could become a major hurricane as it approaches the Caribbean islands. So there's that. Now I want to show the European ensembles, because if we're talking about the wave behind not 95L, we're now in Beryl. But you could obviously see on the European ensembles, Beryl moves into the Caribbean. Definitely lots of certainty now that it'll probably be in the Windward Islands, but you could definitely see the uncertainty that the EPS generally has with how Beryl will be after the Eastern Caribbean. Some of the stronger ensembles you could see definitely tries to bring this northward a little bit more into the Gulf, while we have a lot of the weaker ensembles staying in the Southern Caribbean and potentially moving into Central America. That's the long range aspect of it. But now you could also see on the EPS as well, notice the signal that is coming on really strongly, potentially for the wave behind Beryl. So that means that the European has quite the confidence that we'll see potentially this other wave develop and become a tropical system as well. So that adds on to the fact that the islands may need to watch after Beryl heading into next week. And it does seem like, judging by the ensembles, let's really quickly track it. So that's roughly mid to later next week is when we would see an arrival from this wave that is behind Beryl into the islands. And it is definitely a lot for July. We definitely don't typically get this amount of activity. And I really am going to stress about how unusual it is, because as I talked about before, climatology speaking, we are not really supposed to be seeing any sort of activity occur in this part of the MDR, let alone potentially a major hurricane impacting the Caribbean islands in June and into early July. That we would really only talk about as a threat really in August or maybe September. And we really only look for development in the central Western Caribbean and areas that are closer to home. But the fact that we're seeing all of this, it just goes to show the fruitfulness of how favorable this year is. Atmospherically, one, because typically the trades are really strong throughout this portion of the Atlantic, but there's also the aspect as well, and I'll show you it here right now. There's a sea surface temperature anomaly graphic by the NOAA Coral Reef Watch. Just look at how warm the Atlantic is, and especially throughout portions of the central western MDR. areas averaging at least a degree, even 2 degrees Celsius above normal. And the funny thing is that we still have Saharan air to the north. There's still lots of Saharan air coming off of Africa, but because of how warm the Atlantic is, it's just allowing for that much more energy to be infused into these tropical waves. And that's why we're seeing situations where we see right now, where we have one potential storm that is potentially going to become a major hurricane. And then, despite the fact that we have that in late June, we also have potentially another area to watch out for over the next week or so, generally within the same region of the MDR too, the central western MDR. There's a lot of energy for both of these systems to work with, especially as it heads into the Caribbean. So we'll have to watch out for that. But it also falls into what we've been saying over the last several weeks. Since last week, we've been talking about it, that potentially as we head out into early July and close June, that things would be really active, especially if you look at the velocity potential anomalies, because we saw that there was an increase in rising motion, especially occurring over the Atlantic as we went into these last several days into June. And this is what you could see represented by these green anomalies with the velocity potential map. And as you could see into early July, those do last. So that obviously does show that the potential is there in the atmosphere for more tropical waves to continue to be aggressive. If there's any consolation, though, if you want any consolation about the Atlantic further than that, you do notice that we start to see a bunch of these oranges begin to show up in the Atlantic. So that represents a wave of sinking air is coming into the Atlantic very soon. That probably means conditions will most likely become less favorable for rising air and convective activity across the tropical Atlantic, and that starts to happen closer to mid-July. So we should hopefully, after we get these two areas out of the way, we could hopefully see things quiet down in the Atlantic, and hopefully it's just Beryl and what we have with this other area of interest right now in the MDR that come in and go. And then we have a rest after that before we get into the real meat of the hurricane season as we get towards August. It's definitely going to be interesting to see, though, how much more active it gets, especially if we're already looking at potentially a major hurricane into the islands in late June. It's very bizarre. Definitely quite not like anything you would ever expect. It's definitely quite literally almost unprecedented that we're getting this kind of activity this early. Almost unprecedented because we've seen situations like this, especially in historically active hurricane seasons in the past. And notice that I said historically active hurricane seasons, because most of those years that we would have activity like this early on went on to become really active hurricane seasons. And that falls really well in line with all the forecasts calling for a very busy hurricane season this year. And as I said before, and I'm going to say it again, we're now starting to see that play out before our very own eyes. And this definitely all is indicative of what is to come, whatever does come after we get past Beryl and whatever activity the Atlantic is going to throw at us over the next week. All right, so here's the plan for the rest of today. So I'm going to upload this video. It's roughly almost noon, so this video is definitely going to be a very long one. Hopefully you all found it informative. I'm going to do another update on Beryl later this afternoon, so roughly for the 5 o'clock advisory is when I'm going to do it, going over the latest model guidance from the afternoon and the late morning for Beryl this afternoon around 5 or 6. And then I might do a live sort of stream, a live show to go over what the 8 p.m. advisory not, and I was about to say Alberto, Beryl. They're kind of similar in pronunciation, honestly. But anyways, Beryl, we're going to do a live stream at 8 o'clock tonight, or at least I'm aiming to do that 8 p.m. Eastern time, so East Coast United States time, 8 o'clock. So make sure to stay tuned for that. If you're just tuning into my channel and you want the latest notifications for all of that stuff coming later today, I really encourage you that you like, comment, and especially subscribe. Comment your thoughts below if you have any questions, comments, and especially concerns regarding Beryl. Let me know, and I'll try to answer them as quick as possible. And also follow me on Twitter at Danilo Evangelista, same name as I have here on YouTube, for information that I'll post on Beryl throughout the rest of the day and into tomorrow. Thanks again for watching. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. And we will talk again later today.